Emily's routine was ordinary, almost mindless: work, sleep, and, on rare evenings like this one, a solitary walk. Tonight, the air was thick, nearly oppressive, as if charged with some low, invisible current. She hadn't planned to come this far into the park. Normally, she'd stick to the paths lit by street lamps and skip the overgrown trails that snaked off into the trees. But something felt different tonight. There was a pull, a strange curiosity that tugged her deeper into the shadows under the towering maples and oaks, their twisted limbs stark against the twilight sky. She hadn't noticed the maze at first. One minute she was alone on the path, her thoughts drifting through half-forgotten memories, the ache of old regrets lingering in her chest. Then, rounding a bend, it loomed before her, a vast wall of dark green hedges, tall as a building and dense enough that not even a sliver of light filtered through. The entryway was a yawning mouth, a perfect arch carved out of the greenery, and something about it seemed familiar. She couldn't say why, but it pulled at her, urging her forward. Emily hesitated at the threshold, her fingers grazing the prickly leaves. There was a strange hum to the air around it, like the static charge before a storm. She could feel it brushing against her skin, making the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Her heartbeat quickened, a faint thrumming she felt in her chest and throat. This wasn't normal. The park had always felt like an escape, a place where she could leave her problems behind, if only for an hour. But this was something else, something not meant to be. And yet, she stepped inside. The first few feet were unremarkable, just a path of packed dirt with hedges towering on either side. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, she felt a subtle shift. The noise of the outside world, the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of voices from the park faded into silence, swallowed by the dense walls of green. It was as though she'd stepped into a different realm, one that operated on its own strange rules. The path ahead branched off in several directions, each passage dark and winding. Emily felt a chill creep up her spine as she realized she couldn't see the end of any of them. Each direction seemed to stretch into infinity, a twisting corridor of shadows. She took a deep breath, the air colder than it should have been. The scent was earthy, damp, with an undercurrent of decay, a whiff of something old and forgotten, like the inside of an abandoned house. She moved cautiously down the center path, her footsteps muffled on the soft dirt. The walls of the maze seemed to close in as she walked, pressing against her from all sides. Her mind began to wander, dredging up memories unbidden. Wasn't that the way it always was? She was a woman of quiet regrets, the kind that were easier to ignore than to confront. She'd always prided herself on moving forward, not looking back. But here, the past felt inescapable, lurking behind every bend. Rounding a corner, she stopped in her tracks. There, lying on the ground, was an old bracelet. Tarnished and broken, its silver chain gleamed faintly in the dim light. Emily's breath caught as recognition hit her. It was the bracelet her best friend, Clara, had given her in college. The two of them had spent a wild summer together, swearing to be inseparable. But life had happened, and they drifted apart, their friendship fracturing over petty arguments and misunderstandings, until it crumbled into silence. She knelt to pick it up, her fingers brushing the cold metal. How had it gotten here? She knew she'd lost it years ago, somewhere in her old apartment, but here it was, unmistakably real, a piece of her past lying at her feet. A chill seeped into her bones as she slipped it into her pocket, feeling the weight of it pressing against her thigh. The maze was playing with her, dredging up things she'd long since buried. As she continued down the path, a low whisper reached her ears, barely more than a sigh. She stopped, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. A trick of the mind, she told herself. The isolation was getting to her, making her imagine things. But even as she tried to shake it off, the whisper lingered, like an echo at the edge of her mind. The path branched again, and she took the right turn without thinking, driven by some instinct she didn't understand. The walls seemed closer here, the leaves brushing against her shoulders as she walked. She tried to ignore the sensation, but it was impossible. The maze seemed alive, breathing around her, its dark green tendrils stretching towards her like grasping fingers. The next turn opened into a small clearing, and in the center was a stone bench covered in moss. She hesitated, a sense of déjà vu prickling at the back of her mind. She'd never been here before. Of that she was certain. But the bench felt familiar, as though it had been waiting for her all along. She sat down, the cold seeping through her clothes, and tried to steady her breathing. The silence here was complete, so thick it felt like a presence in itself, pressing down on her, filling her ears with a low, steady hum. Her gaze drifted to the ground, where something glinted in the dirt, a broken necklace, tangled and tarnished. Her stomach twisted as she recognized it, a gift from an old lover, a relationship that had ended in bitterness and regret. She'd tossed it away, convinced she'd moved on, but seeing it here, half buried in the dirt, brought back memories she'd tried to forget. The arguments, the hurtful words, the guilt that lingered long after they'd parted ways. Emily's fingers trembled as she reached for the necklace, but before she could touch it, a sound broke the silence, a laugh, high and clear, echoing through the maze. She froze, her heart pounding as the laugh grew louder, morphing into something dark and twisted. It sounded like a child, but there was something wrong about it, something that set her teeth on edge. "Emily," the voice called, stretching her name into a taunt. Her skin prickled with fear. She looked around, but there was no one there, only the silent walls of the maze pressing in around her. She took a step back, her gaze darting around as the voice continued, whispering fragments of memories she hadn't thought of in years. "You shouldn't have lied. You left me. You never cared." Each accusation struck her like a blow, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She turned and ran, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she tried to escape the voice. But no matter how far she went, it followed, relentless. At last, she stumbled into another dead end, her back pressed against the wall of hedges as the whispers closed in. Her heart raced, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and guilt. She didn't understand what was happening, but a part of her knew. This maze wasn't just a place. It was alive, feeding on her secrets, her regrets, turning them against her. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the shadows, a child no more than 7, with wide, accusing eyes. The girl's face was familiar, achingly so, and as Emily stared, the truth hit her like a physical blow. It was her, a memory of herself from years ago, staring back with a cold, unforgiving gaze. Emily's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, unable to tear her eyes away from the child. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice caught in her throat. The child's mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. You can't hide from me. You can't hide from yourself. A sob escaped her, raw and desperate, as the child faded into the shadows, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her past pressing down on her, crushing her under its relentless grip. And somewhere, deep within the maze, the walls seemed to shift, the path closing in tighter, as if it was drawing her deeper, pulling her into its dark, twisted heart. The walls of the maze seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting like a living organism around her. Emily's steps were slower now, her senses heightened and raw. Every crackle of a branch, every brush of a leaf against her arm sent a jolt through her. She knew she should be scared, that she should turn back and retrace her steps to the entrance. But that path felt as impossible as escaping her own skin. The further she went, the more the maze tightened its grip on her, drawing her into its heart with a strange, unyielding purpose. After what felt like an hour of walking in circles, she reached another intersection. This time, 3 paths stretched out before her, each one darker than the last. She hesitated, a gnawing dread twisting in her stomach. She could feel it. Something was waiting for her, lurking in the shadows just out of sight. She tried to calm her breathing, but the air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She could almost taste the musty rot on her tongue. A low, insistent whisper filled her mind. This is where you belong. You can't escape. The voice was her own, but it was layered with something else, something darker, an undercurrent of malice that sent chills down her spine. Her hands shook as she clenched them into fists, her nails biting into her palms. The pain grounded her, if only for a moment. Just keep moving, she told herself, taking the path to the left. But the deeper she went, the more the maze seemed to warp around her, twisting her memories, her sense of self. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, faces she recognized but couldn't place, voices calling her name in tones that ranged from tender to accusatory. Suddenly, she found herself in front of a tall mirror, its surface smeared with grime and dust. Her reflection stared back at her, hollow-eyed and pale, as though she were seeing herself after years of grief. She reached out to touch the glass, and as her fingers met her own image, it rippled, warping her features. Her reflection sneered back at her, mouth twisting into a cruel grin. "Do you even know who you are?" it whispered, its voice laced with contempt. She stepped back, her heart pounding as the reflection's grin grew wider, stretching impossibly across its face. She could feel its mocking gaze boring into her, a searing accusation she couldn't shake. This is what you are, a hollow, pitiful shell. The mirror shattered, and in its place was another path, opening up like a wound in the hedge wall. She took a shaky breath, stepping through the broken shards scattered on the ground. As she moved forward, the air grew colder, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint sounds of crying echoing through the maze. It was her own voice, fragile and weak, sobbing in the distance. Emily followed the sound, her footsteps quickening despite the fear gnawing at her gut. The crying grew louder, sharper, until it filled the space around her, pressing against her ears, drowning out her thoughts. It led her to another clearing, smaller than the last, and in the center was a single item, an old, worn-out teddy bear with one eye missing, its fur matted and stained. The sight of it made her chest tighten, her throat constricting with a familiar ache. She recognized the bear immediately. It had been her only comfort during a difficult childhood, a silent witness to the secrets she kept hidden from the world. She hadn't thought about it in years, had almost forgotten it even existed. But here it was, staring up at her with that single accusing eye. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was small, trembling, a child's voice laced with fear and betrayal. Emily looked around, but she was alone in the clearing. She knelt beside the bear, her fingers brushing over its rough, stained fur. Memories flooded her mind, nights spent hiding in her room, clutching the bear as she tried to drown out the sounds of shouting from the other side of the wall. "You abandoned me," the voice whispered again, closer this time, as if it were coming from inside her own mind. "You abandoned yourself." She felt a pang of guilt, an old festering wound she'd thought had healed long ago. But here, in the maze, it was raw, exposed, demanding her attention. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. The maze was forcing her to confront the parts of herself she'd buried, the parts she'd left behind, and she could feel it feeding off her fear, her guilt, each memory a morsel for it to consume. "No," she thought, clenching her fists. "I won't let this place break me." She stood, the bear slipping from her hands, and walked away, refusing to look back. But the guilt clung to her like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. The walls of the maze seemed to close in tighter, pressing against her, forcing her to confront the weight of her choices. As she continued through the maze, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. She was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone. And yet, every now and then, she felt a presence behind her, a shadow that flickered just out of sight. She could hear footsteps echoing her own, a second set that stopped whenever she did, that turned each corner with her, always keeping its distance, but never leaving. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling, but the silence swallowed her words, giving nothing back. Her heart raced as she stumbled forward, desperate to escape the unseen pursuer. She knew it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real, but her mind was fraying, unraveling thread by thread. Each step felt heavier, as though the maze itself was draining her strength, leeching away her sense of reality. She reached another dead end, and this time there was no way forward, no hidden path opening up in the wall. She was trapped, her own reflection staring back at her from the dark, glassy surface of the hedge. She could see the fear in her eyes, the exhaustion etched into her features. She looked like a stranger, someone hollow and broken. The whispers began again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices layering over each other until she couldn't tell where one ended and another began. They spoke of regrets, of mistakes she'd tried to forget, of failures that haunted her in the quiet moments of her life. They spoke of loneliness, of a life spent running from herself, of the fear that had always held her back. "Why do you keep running?" one voice asked, a woman's voice that sounded eerily like her own. "What are you so afraid of?" Emily closed her eyes, the words cutting through her like a knife. She wanted to answer, to explain, but there were no words that could capture the fear clawing at her heart. She had spent so much of her life avoiding these questions, burying them deep beneath a facade of control. But here, in the maze, there was no escape. The walls pressed closer, the shadows deepening, as if they were waiting for her to break. A sudden, piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing through the maze. It was her scream, raw and primal, a sound torn from the depths of her soul. She collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching her head, as the voices grew louder, filling her mind with accusations, regrets, fears she could no longer ignore. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The maze fell silent, the shadows retreating, leaving her alone in the cold, suffocating darkness. She took a shuddering breath, her body trembling as she struggled to regain control. But she knew deep down that she was losing herself, piece by piece, to the maze. The path opened up again, a narrow, twisting corridor stretching into the darkness. She rose to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady, and took a step forward, knowing that there was no turning back. The maze had shown her a glimpse of her own darkness, a reflection of the fears and regrets that had haunted her for so long. But it wasn't finished with her yet. Emily moved forward, each step heavier than the last. Her limbs felt leaden, her breaths shallow. It was as though the maze was drawing her in, siphoning what remained of her strength. She didn't dare look back. The path behind her had already faded into shadows, sealing her in. There was only the way forward, a narrow, twisting corridor that seemed to ripple and sway, as if the walls themselves were alive. The air was frigid, biting against her skin and filling her lungs with an icy burn. The silence was absolute, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She could hear the echo of her own heartbeat, a slow, unsteady rhythm that seemed to sync with the pulse of the maze. Her mind drifted, blurring the boundary between memory and reality, her past and her present becoming indistinguishable. Every step felt like falling, deeper into a place she couldn't claw her way out of. She stopped as the path opened into a final clearing, larger than any she'd seen before. The ground was bare, the dirt cold and packed tight, and in the center stood a lone figure. She blinked, her heart racing, her mind grasping for explanations, but the figure remained, unmoving, waiting. It was her, Emily, standing there, her face twisted with a mixture of pity and disdain. This version of herself was everything she tried to hide, every aspect of her personality she despised. The figure's eyes were hollow, her face pale and gaunt, her lips curled into a mocking smile. She wore Emily's regrets like a cloak, every line of her body a testament to the mistakes she had buried deep, hoping to forget. Emily took a hesitant step forward, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her other self mirrored her movement, tilting her head, the smile widening into something cruel. "Who are you?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection laughed, a hollow, brittle sound that echoed through the maze. "You know who I am. I'm you, the you you're too afraid to face, the part of you that you left here, abandoned, hoping it would wither and die. But I don't die. I'm you." Emily's chest tightened, a cold dread creeping through her veins. She wanted to deny it, to scream that this wasn't her, but the words wouldn't come, because she knew, deep down, that it was the truth. She had spent years running from herself, from the shadows she carried, the regrets she couldn't face. And now, here, in the heart of the maze, there was no escape. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The other Emily's smile faded, her expression hardening. "You tell me. You came looking for me, didn't you? You wanted to forget, to bury everything you didn't want to be. But things like me don't disappear. I live inside you, waiting, feeding on every lie you tell yourself." Emily felt her resolve weakening. her mind splintering under the weight of her own self-loathing. The maze had stripped her of everything, leaving her raw, exposed. She could feel her strength slipping away, her identity dissolving, merging with the dark, twisted figure before her. The other Emily took a step closer, her eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. You've spent your life hiding, pretending to be someone you're not. But here, there's nowhere left to hide. Emily tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, her body frozen. The other Emily's voice grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, filling her mind with accusations, regrets, all the things she had tried so hard to forget. You abandoned your friends. You betrayed those who trusted you. You're nothing but a coward, running from yourself. The words cut through her like a blade, each one a wound that tore her apart, piece by piece. No, Emily whispered, her voice choked with desperation. I tried. I tried to be better. The other Emily laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. Better? You think hiding from yourself makes you better? You think running from your mistakes changes anything? You're a shadow, hollow and empty, pretending to be whole. Emily's knees buckled, her hands clutching at her chest as a wave of despair washed over her. The maze felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating her, as if it were feeding on her misery, her fear. She could feel herself unraveling, her sense of self slipping away, dissolving into the darkness. No, she whispered again, more to herself than to the figure before her. This isn't who I am. The other Emily's face twisted, her expression a mask of fury. You don't get to decide that. You left me here, left yourself here, and now there's nothing left of you. Emily closed her eyes, her mind reeling, her heart pounding with a frantic, erratic beat. She could feel the maze pulling her in, its tendrils wrapping around her, drawing her deeper into the darkness. She was losing herself, slipping into the void, becoming nothing more than a shadow, a memory. But as she teetered on the edge, a faint, fragile spark ignited within her. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was hers. It was the part of her that had refused to give up, the part that had kept going even when everything else had fallen apart. She opened her eyes, meeting the gaze of her twisted reflection. I made mistakes, she said, her voice soft but steady. I hurt people. I hurt myself, but that doesn't define me. The other Emily's face contorted with rage, her form flickering, becoming less solid, more shadow than substance. You think you can just ignore me, pretend I don't exist? No, Emily replied, her voice growing stronger. I'm not ignoring you. I'm accepting you. You're part of me, but you don't control me. The maze shuddered, the walls trembling as the shadows seemed to recoil. The other Emily let out a scream, a sound that echoed through the maze, raw and piercing. Her form wavered, flickering in and out of existence, as though the acceptance was draining her power, unraveling the darkness that had bound her. Emily took a step forward, her gaze steady, her heart resolute. I'm done running, she said, her voice echoing through the maze. I'm done hiding. With those words, the shadows began to dissolve, the walls fading into mist, the maze unraveling around her. The other Emily let out one last agonized scream before vanishing into the darkness, her form dissipating like smoke. And then there was silence. Emily stood alone in the clearing, the ground bare beneath her feet, the air still and quiet. She felt a strange sense of peace, a weight lifting from her chest. The maze was gone, the shadows that had haunted her fading into nothingness. She took a deep breath, her lungs filling with fresh, clean air, and looked around. She was standing at the edge of the park, the trees silhouetted against the first light of dawn. The maze was nowhere to be seen, as if it had never existed, but she knew, deep down, that it had been real. It had been a part of her, a reflection of the darkness she had carried within herself. And though she had faced it, though she had survived, she knew it would always be there, a part of her that she could never truly escape. But now, she could live with it. Emily turned, her steps light, her heart steady. She left the park, the shadows behind her, the dawn breaking on the horizon. And somewhere, deep within the folds of her memory, the maze lingered, waiting, a reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are the ones we carry within ourselves.